Hey, good morning. Today is Friday, November the 24th, 2023. This is Wes Fryer. I'm here in our home in Matthews, North Carolina, and I am very excited to talk about this podcast called The Fall of the Aztecs by The Rest is History. It's by Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook, who are historians, and I'm excited to share about this for a couple reasons. Number one, I'm just a real history geek, and I'm someone who loves especially history about the encounter of cultures, the age of exploration, the conquest of the Americas, the tragedy of European colonialism. You know, you have different lenses of describing this, but basically, you know, when I was in college as an undergraduate, I was a Latin American area studies major. I ended up going to Mexico City on a Fulbright scholarship, and I studied for a year. I had friends who had relatives that owned one of the haciendas owned by Hernan Cortes that I got to go, stay at several times. And, during that year, traveling in different parts of Latin America, not only in Mexico, I've traveled in the Caribbean and Central America, a little bit in South America and Peru. I am just a real history geek, but I love all of the intersections that we have. And today, in this fall of 2023, I find myself as a middle school STEM teacher, and I'm teaching computer programming, and my class is actually building a virtual colony on Mars using Minecraft and software called Microsoft MakeCode. And so as I discovered this podcast this holiday, and I'm going to share multiple connections to this podcast because this reminds me a lot of Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. If you love history, these are great podcasts. One of the reasons I'm sharing this is because, one of the benefits and the tremendously wonderful aspects of social media today, even though it's sort of confusing and it's polluted and it's fractured and there's all these different choices, boy, when you find somebody who's passionate about a topic that you're passionate about and then they share other resources, that leads sometimes to reading books, it leads to listening to podcasts, sometimes watching videos. So I'm just really excited about this entire history, the chapter of Hernan Cortes landing in Mexico, confronting, Montezuma, the conquest of the Aztec Empire, but the collision of civilizations, all the implications that had, not only for Mexican history, but the history of North America, colonialism, slavery, the legacies of oppression, of economic poverty. There's just so much. So let me first just tell you, you can find this podcast if you just Google The Rest is History, and specifically you can Google The Fall of the Aztecs. I'm going to provide some links to these things I'm talking about in the description of this YouTube video. Dominic Sandbrook has a book called The Fall of the Aztecs, which I have not read yet, but it's actually a children's book and it's part of a series. So you can find all of that. And you can also just go to their website, which is restishistorypod.com. And the other thing I'll say is one of the reasons I'm recording this is it is so much faster for me and for many people, not everybody, but for many people, to verbally express ideas rather than just write them. I love blogging. I've been blogging since 2003, so that's 20 years ago, I guess I started. I set up my blog on WordPress in 2005. It takes a while, though, to write and craft a post. And so one of the reasons I'm doing this is I'm playing with media. That's the name of my first book, because there's a new workflow that I have experienced, but I haven't really done this in the same format I'm doing right now, which is I'm going to put this video on YouTube. I'm going to wait till the YouTube algorithms transcribe this and create a transcript. And rather than just take that exact transcript and put that on my blog, I'm going to ask AI, ChatGPT 4 in this case, which I'm paying $20 a month to have the enhanced version, to just help me clean up and improve the writing. But I'm going to ask it to model itself off of my own writings. I haven't done that yet. My friend Jason Neiffer, who I do most weeks, a weekly podcast called the EdTech Situation Room, has done this, where you can give it documents. Like, I can give it my dissertation, I can give it a whole host of blog posts, and I can say, hey, ChatGPT, copy edit this for me and match my writing so that it can be part of the style of my writing. Okay, and then I guess the last thing I'll share, and I'll probably say this at the end too, is if you want to connect with me, to continue learning with me, there's a bunch of places where you can do that. And the website wesfryer.com/after is a place where you can connect with me. And I think I'll probably just put that at the bottom of this video, because even though platforms and things like that will change, I quit Twitter this week finally. I'm on other platforms like Facebook and Mastodon and Threads and Blue Sky and places like that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this episode. So this is a 7-part episode called The Fall of the Aztecs, and I have actually listened to part 7 because that's when I discovered it, which is sort of the end of the story, and then I have just listened to the first part, which is called The Adventure Begins. And as I said, Dominic Sandbrook has written a book about this whole era of history, this whole episode, called The Fall of the Aztecs. I mentioned that this podcast, and let me just say first off, man, and this is true of this video too, right? I love open-ended, sort of unbounded media sharing formats. So this YouTube video is an example, a podcast where no one is telling you, oh, you only have 5 minutes. Now, there's a lot of value in compressing and shortening something that you want to say. I found this as a teacher, and now a middle school STEM teacher. When I'm preparing a lesson for my students, if I record a video, I can I can always be more concise, and I can be faster when I have a video version that I share with students. When I'm teaching a lesson that uses like websites and apps and things like that, doing a demo lesson, than just doing a live demo in class. And so it's interesting, because usually I opt to do the live demo and then give students a video they could watch if they're absent or they want to get this again. But sometimes I'll, of course, mess up. And when I mess up and have to re-record, then it's usually even shorter and it's more concise, etc. So anyway, it's great to be able to synthesize and hone and really perfect the message that you want to share. But at the same time, boy, it is so freeing to be able to share what you want to share and not be in, let's say, the constraints of traditional broadcast media, whether that's radio or television. Constraints can be positive and powerful for creativity, but they can also be extremely liberating and just wonderful when you're really geeking out about something and you don't want to do it in 5 minutes. You want to take a little bit more time. So I don't know how many years ago, I love podcasts. In fact, I think probably on my after page, and if not, I'll put the link in there. You can link to the podcast that I subscribe to with Pocket Casts. Pocket Casts is just the app that I use on my phone, primarily, sometimes on my iPad, to listen to podcasts. I have a lot of diverse interests. In fact, I think that the intersection of interests oftentimes leads to lovely and wonderful serendipity and discovery. And maybe this is kind of an example of this. So Dan Carlin is a great storyteller and podcaster, and he charges money for his podcasts, many of his podcasts, and I don't know exactly his freemium model, but I was able to get his Wrath of the Khans series, which was Hardcore History, I think episodes 43 through 47, and I'll include a link. His website is dancarlin.com, so it's DANCARLIN.com. And you can access that series. He's also got a great one called Supernova in the East, and I think that one's still on his free channel, which is about World War II. Man, just so many fantastic stories and deep dives. Again, as a geek of history and a lover of history, this episode series on the Aztecs and the fall of the Aztecs really does remind me a lot of that. Let me talk about the fourth part of the world, and I'll tell a little bit about Mexico City and living there. So another wonderful, wonderful book. In fact, I own this on paperback, I own it on Kindle, and I've read it multiple times. It's by an author named Toby Lester, and the book is called The Fourth Part of the World, The Race to the Ends of the Earth and the Epic Story of the Map that Gave America Its Name. Now everyone else in our house is still asleep, recovering from Thanksgiving dinner yesterday, so I'm not recording this in my office, which is a guest room, where I have this big blow-up version of the Waldseemüller map. But what's known as the Waldseemüller map, or America's birth certificate, is the most expensive thing the Library of Congress has ever purchased. It was purchased for $10 million. And this book by Toby Lester is the story of this map, which I think was made in 1502, 1503. And it represents kind of the culmination not only of European cartography and perceptions of the borders of the known world, but it's also a synthesis of what the cartographers and historians at that time believed was their inheritance from Ptolemy and the Greek knowledge of the world and Alexander the Great, but mythology and superstition and a whole lot is wrapped into this map. But this was the first map that showed the Americas, both North and South America, completely surrounded by water. And so it was very significant for that reason. That's a fantastic book. And the connections there between history and geography and the technology of the day and religion and faith and cartography, the drawing of maps and the ways in which maps represent an understanding at a particular time from a particular vantage point of the world. Just absolutely love that. Okay, living in Mexico City. So one of the biggest decisions that I had to make in my life at one point was upon graduating from the Air Force Academy, where I graduated in 1992, did I want to try to go immediately to pilot training, or did I want to accept an offer to take a Fulbright scholarship and study in Mexico City for a year? Had a wonderful, wonderful professor and instructor at the Air Force Academy, Michael Jajic, Colonel Jajic, who was in the political science department. He had studied for his doctorate in Mexico, and I think he actually did a dissertation about the F-5 aircraft program that Mexico had. Anyway, he had connections there, and my proposal was to actually try and get a conference about collective security. These were in the heady days of, the end of the Cold War and the New World Order, and what would the security framework for the Americas be in the New World Order, since we weren't, since the Soviet Union had fallen and democracy was ascendant. This is when Francis Fukuyama had published, The End of History, which was rather optimistic and naive. But still, it was an important work, and we're just wondering how collective security and other things were going to play out. And what ended up happening was I wrote a series of 4 papers, which you can still get online, actually. About the drug war in the Americas, about collective security. What else did I write about? I wrote 4 papers. But anyway, I didn't end up getting that conference happening, and then I didn't end up even applying that degree, those studies immediately towards a degree, because I ended up getting out of the Air Force. I became a school teacher, ended up getting a master's in education and a doctorate in curriculum and instruction, and just took a different track. But I love Latin American history. And when I lived there in Mexico City, one of my friends who I lived with his family, and then he lived with me for a while, Sean Conaway, had a friend named Felipe Fenton. In fact, I share his name specifically because one of the things that's both crazy and just amazing about the day in which we live is, so I'm going to share this on YouTube. Well, this video is going to be transcribed. And I would love to connect again with Felipe. Felipe's grandfather was a jeweler, and this was in 1992, 93 when I knew him. Good friend of Sean's. I think he and Sean were going to college class together. And Felipe's father owned the second hacienda of Hernan Cortes, that is south of Mexico City, in a beautiful area called Cuernavaca. And one of the haciendas that Cortes owned was at that time, and may still be, a hotel that you can stay in commercially as a guest. But this other one was his private, was a private residence. And wow, we went down there at least 2 different weekends and stayed in the hacienda. And I could tell more stories about that. But wow, the history, and I mean, my Spanish is okay. There was a man there who was, I guess, like the property curator, or the person who was on property to take property manager. He'd been there a long time, and I guess Sean had gotten him to tell him some stories about that place. And so just the history that goes with that. Well, here's a fast one. That hacienda at some point in time, I guess, after the death of Cortes, obviously, because Cortes was there in the early 1500s, it became a convent. Well, at the time we were there was active excavations happening archaeologically to uncover different parts of the hacienda. And they found some skeletons of babies that were buried in the walls of the hacienda, which was a convent, which they believed at that time must have been babies that were born to the nuns that were living there, but they were most likely killed and buried in the walls. There are so many different aspects of that history, but being in Mexico City and the juxtaposition of cultures, right? Because the place in Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Aztec Empire, right on top of that is where the Cathedral of Mexico is built, which is sinking because it's a lake bed, right? And so there's also excavations that have happened there, to reveal the Aztec architecture and buildings. And of course there was human sacrifice that was happening there. But it's also interesting to study all this history and hear these stories and think about, what aspects of it, and hear historians that are dedicating their lives to the study talk about the aspects of these different stories which they think may have been embellished or in some cases even invented, especially as in this case the Spaniards were telling these stories for an audience back home. I had the opportunity to climb the volcano Popo, which is Popocatépetl. It's one of 2 volcanoes south of Mexico City, and so the valley between these two is called the Valley of Cortes. And when Cortes landed on the coast at present-day Veracruz, he burned his ships and then eventually marched his men into the Valley of Mexico. He crossed into the Valley of Mexico through that pass, and the 2 volcanoes are Ixtaccíhuatl and Popocatépetl. They're both over 17,000 feet high, so that's the highest mountain I've ever climbed in my life, and probably will be, because I don't anticipate, being a mountaineer ascending super high peaks anymore in my life. But man, was that ever amazing to climb that volcano, stare into the mouth. It actually had some eruptions and activity after we had climbed it there, and that would have been probably early 1993, but then also just the history, So anyway, I hear all this, having, some personal experiences, a little bit with the area and these places. Let me talk a little bit about space exploration in Mars. So, as I record this in November of 2023, it's exceptionally interesting and exciting to see what is happening with the space program, not only in the United States, but also globally. And we've had a lot of changes in the last 10 or so years. SpaceX has played a significant part of that, the commercialization of space. But as I record this, I think that quite a number of people are expecting that NASA and the United States, with international partners, is going to return to the moon, because we haven't been to the moon since 1972. NASA sent 6 missions starting in July of 69 with humans to land on the moon. There have been a lot of rovers and other, uncrewed spacecraft that have landed on the moon, but also attempted to land on the moon. And so anyway, the plan is with the Artemis program to return to the moon and establish a presence there, and then use that as a launching point to go to Mars. And there's this vision that we're going to colonize Mars. In fact, there's a book that I just recently stumbled across where I think the authors are really, questioning the practicality of that and a lot of aspects of it. Anyway, I am, as a student of history and a teacher who loves multidisciplinary connections to life, right? Life is complicated, and sometimes I think as teachers we can oversimplify things to the point where that might even, reduce the engagement that students have with material and with skills and things. Boy, when you talk about something like the exploration of Mars, one of the things, and I really haven't brought this into my class, but I kind of think this podcast is going to be a catalyst for it, is we need to think about the choices that were made by the Spaniards and others who came to what they perceived to be the New World in the Americas and imposed their colonial worldview and economic system and culture onto the people that they found in the Americas. The collision of cultures that's represented in just that happened, right? As Europeans came to the Americas, absolutely devastating for native culture, in large part because of disease, right? We moved here to North Carolina 2 years ago from Oklahoma. We spent 16 years living in Oklahoma. I think there are 36 federally recognized tribes and different nations that live within the boundaries of modern-day Oklahoma, because Oklahoma was Indian territory before it became a state in 1907. And having lived there and taught there and worked there for, 16 years, I gained a much wider and deeper awareness. I still feel like I'm very much a beginner learning about, native culture, but one of the things that was mentioned at some point to me or I read about is, when we think about genocide and attempted genocide, because there's been attempted genocide by the Nazis against the Jewish people in the Holocaust in World War II. There was an Armenian genocide. In fact, that's a very controversial thing in modern day Turkey because many of the Turkish historians and I think Turkish nationalists and Turkish political leaders have been very, very adamant that that was not a genocide, and they haven't wanted the United States to say that was a genocide and for historians to write that as a genocide. Look, Native people have experienced a genocide, right? In this first episode of this podcast, they talk quite a bit about Hispaniola, which was the island that Christopher Columbus, Cristobal Colon, I think we're going to take his Spanish name, landed thinking he was in India, right, in the Indies, modern day on the east side, the Dominican Republic, Haiti on the west. I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but they're like Google it really quick. I'm going to Google native people of Hispaniola. They were called the Tainos, so that's Taino, an Arawak-speaking people who became arriving from the Yucatan Peninsula as early as 4000 BC. Those folks are all gone, okay? They were completely exterminated by the Spaniards. They were enslaved, and you know, the Taino people were also in Cuba. I don't know if some survive in Cuba. They're completely, as far as I know, gone from Hispaniola. But you know, the folks who came over to, quote, the New World, or we'll call it the Americas, from Europe, had a certain psychological character. One of the things that that the authors of this podcast, Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook, say in this first episode is that you can think of the conquistadors as armed entrepreneurs. Thought that was an interesting phrase. The ways in which colonial oppression of people, the dehumanization of other human beings became institutionalized, the ways in which Christianity and the Christian church, I would say, was weaponized and was perverted in heretical ways to oppress native people, to dehumanize people, and then to use the institutions of the Christian church as a way to systematically oppress and hold in poverty and in servitude millions and millions of people, I think was regrettable and terrible. And I think there are wonderful, wonderful aspects to capitalism and to entrepreneurial economic activity and the opportunities for people to be able to better themselves and, you know, better themselves economically and in other ways as well. But I think it's super, super important that we study colonialism, colonial history, and here's the connection to Mars and to space exploration, right? The European conception of property and the idea that, these lands, Cortes claims these lands for Spain, and they're owned then by the Spanish crown. And then individual, in this case, white immigrants, foreigners, take possession of this land and then, divide it out, separate it. The whole thing about land grants, encomiendas, I think, where it's like a plantation. So it was, it wasn't just a farm, but they were basically small colonies that individuals owned, and then they had slaves and peasants and others, that worked on them. And all of that history, it's embedded in here, right? Because the collision of cultures that happens when Cortes and the Spaniards, enter the Valley of Mexico and eventually, defeat the Aztecs, all of that just ripples through history. I think that it's important for us to confront the brutal realities of history, but also maintain our hope and avoid falling off the precipice of nihilism. And I've thought a lot about this. My wife and I actually completed a 9-week course this past fall. We just finished it, I think, 2 weeks ago, and it's called Confronting Whiteness. And it was started by a pastor here in Charlotte, North Carolina, who's the pastor of Myers Park Baptist Church, which has been a predominantly white Protestant Christian church and congregation. And part of the reason, there were several things that were the genesis or origin story of that course. One of them was the pastor and his wife adopting an African-American daughter and their journey as white parents of an adopted African-American daughter in our culture and all the things that they learned. But also when George Floyd was murdered and the Black Lives Matter movement took place and happened, wanting to find constructive ways to move forward in our understanding of racial issues and also history, right? confronting history. And boy, that was a very tough class to be in. It was wonderful for me for the first time to read the writings of James Baldwin and Malcolm X, among others. I had read, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s writings and done some study. I read Native Son by Richard Wright. One of the things you do in that course is a racial autobiography, and I'll include a link because that study has been a catalyst for me for wanting to start a project I'm calling Healing Our Culture, because aspirationally, one of the things that I believe as a teacher and citizen and follower of Jesus is that we need to find ways that we are healing our culture rather than wounding our culture. The historic trauma that we have experienced as a society because of chattel slavery, because of colonialism, because of, I would say, some of the worst aspects of unregulated capitalism, have produced a legacy of trauma and wounds which have not fully healed and which we can see in different ways in our society are scars and which need to be healed. And so in all of this, it's possible to lose hope. It's possible to feel like it's hopeless, like, oh my gosh, this oppression, the ways in which human beings are brutal and treat others. I can not imagine in many ways what it is like to be a member of a First Nation community, of a indigenous community that has experienced near genocide. Again, when I was in Oklahoma, somebody had pointed out, we have the survivors of genocide right here in North America, specifically in Oklahoma, but also here in North Carolina, because if you are a representative and a member of an indigenous tribe, you and your ancestors have suffered tremendously because of the ways in which, in most cases, the predominantly white, immigrants, and in the case of Latin America, we will call them conquistadors, we would call them colonists here in the United States, but all of that history. And so I think it's so important to maintain hope and to recognize that amidst all the suffering and everything that we read about all this, which was just so tragic, and I think we're drawn to this almost in a sort of, I don't know if this is the right way to say this, prurient interest. Like, it's sort of like, we like to drama and tragedy and sometimes conflict. It makes for good storytelling and good stories, and we're kind of drawn to that as human beings. But there's heroism, there is beauty in the love and the support that people have given to others, to the healing. And so amidst the tragedy, amidst all the suffering, I think it's really important that we maintain hope. I don't know if I articulated that very well. As a student of Latin American history and culture, I am fascinated in the ways in which, culture and economics have been shaped not only by geography, but also by human choices. And it's interesting, they talk about this in the podcast, whether or not, the choices that Cortes made would have actually altered the trajectory of the cultural collisions that happened between European nations and European peoples and the peoples in the Americas, or if that was, a more or less inevitable collision. The bringing of smallpox and other diseases, unfortunately, I guess that was going to happen. And because at some points in history, there are some examples. I'm thinking of the United States, when there were blankets, I think, provided to maybe the Sioux tribe in the Dakotas that had smallpox in them. And there's some terrible, terrible chapters where there was some intentionality of sharing disease to try to wipe out a nation and a people. I don't think that the Spanish explorers realized, in 1519, when Cortes took his men to land on the coast of Mexico, like that they were bringing smallpox. But anyway, it's important to study and understand the ways in which all these things are shaped together. I think it's really important to introduce students to some of these historical characters, but also the contemporary ideas and debates, because there are many ways in which this history has been revised, right? Really quick, when I started to study education after I got out of the Air Force, I became a post-baccalaureate student at Texas Tech University in the College of Education, which meant I had my bachelor's degree, but I was going back for my teacher certification. And I think I needed to take 2 more classes beyond that to get my master's degree. Well, one of my best courses that I really, really enjoyed was my children's literature course. One of the books that we read is called Encounter by Jane Yolen. And it presents a very different version than the mythological, Christopher Columbus as the hero discovering the New World and bringing Christianity to the Americas, because it really portrays this collision of cultures and the ways in which the Spanish conquistadors really weren't great guys in a lot of ways, right? And, that was a very destructive collision of cultures from the perspective of the native and indigenous people that were here. And so I think it's really important that we find ways to do this, but I don't think we want to simply shatter the mythological stories sometimes that we've been told and that sometimes are told in history classes without hope, because the drive for justice, for equal treatment, and for the dignity of human beings, right? This is so important, because Bartolomé de las Casas, I think I'm going to say his name right, wrote an amazing book called The Desolation of the Americas. And he eventually became a friar, but he accompanied Cortes and other conquistadors and really became an outspoken advocate and voice for indigenous people in the Americas. And one of the things I think that De las Casas was really striving to get the Spaniards at that time to see and to recognize was the humanity of every person, right? Whether they looked different and spoke, whatever language that they spoke, like there's universal dignity, there are universal human rights, and I think that's really important for us to keep in mind as we intersect with these historical events and historical characters. So, having recorded this for about 38 minutes, there's no way I was going to write this up as a blog post this morning and be able to articulate all the different ideas and resources that I have churning in my mind. I'm excited to put this on YouTube and get this transcription, and so I'll include a link in the video to the blog post, which will be cleaned up a little bit, copy edited by ChatGPT, but these are my words, right? These are my ideas, and I think it's really, really powerful to think about the ways in which AI can really augment us as human beings. So human plus AI equals bionic human. And so I've started to collect a whole series of uses of artificial intelligence because I'm using it weekly, if not daily, as a teacher right now, middle school teacher. You can find those at wfryer.me/tips. That'll forward you to a Google Doc. So anyway, there you go. There's my strong endorsement for this podcast, The Fall of the Aztecs, by Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook. A lot of other resources that relate to it. I hope that as a student of history, as someone interested in not only educating ourselves, but also sharing an education with others and encouraging others to be on a journey of learning with history, but also with culture, right? That in doing this, we can not only find engaging and interesting and exciting things to read and study and watch and listen to, but I hope we can become agents of cultural healing. And we can not only focus on amplifying tragedy and loss and the polarization which can happen across all kinds of issues and topics, especially if we talk about colonial history and racial oppression and these kinds of things. but I think we can find hope and we can find healing, and it's so important for us to, confront and intersect with real history and not just a whitewashed version of history. It's engaging to do, and it's also a calling as professional educators, but citizens of our society. All right. If you want to connect with me, you can, again, go to the link wesfryer.com/after. And I've got a lot of places where I'm sharing, and have written a couple books and then aspire to get a number of additional books, hopefully published in the upcoming years when I still can. So have a great Thanksgiving holiday if you're happening to see this now. Christmas holidays, wherever you are in space and time, I wish blessings to you. Take care.